Yechezk'el, Ezekiel chapter 40. In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, this was the 14th year after the city of Jerusalem was struck. It was on that very day that the hand of Adonai was on me, and he took me there. In visions, God brought me into the land of Israel and put me down on a very high mountain. On it, toward the south, it seemed that a city was being built. That is where he took me, and there in front of me was a man whose appearance was like bronze. He had a flax cord and a measuring rod in his hand, and he stood in the gateway. The man said to me, "Human being, look with your eyes, hear with your ears, and pay attention to all the things I am showing you, because the reason you were brought here is so that I could show them to you. Tell everything you see to the house of Israel." There was a wall surrounding the house. The man had in his hand a measuring rod 6 cubits long, 10.5 feet, each cubit 21 inches, being a normal cubit 18 inches, plus a handbreadth 3 inches. He measured the wall's width at 10.5 feet, and its height 10.5 feet. He went to the east gate, climbed its steps, and measured one of the gate's doorposts at 10.5 feet wide, and the other one the same. There were guard rooms, each 10.5 feet square. The distance between the guard rooms was 8 3/4 feet. The threshold of the gate adjoining the gate's entranceway facing the house measured 10.5 feet. He measured the gate's entranceway facing the house at 10.5 feet. Then he measured the gate's entranceway itself 14 feet, and its supports 3.5 feet. The gate's entranceway was on the side facing the house. There were 3 guard rooms on each side of the east gate, all the same size, and on each side the supports between the guard rooms were also on the same size. He measured the width of the opening to the gateway at 17.5 feet, and the width of the passage through the gateway at 22 3/4 feet. There was a partition in front of the guard rooms on one side, 21 inches wide, and a partition on the other side, 21 inches wide, and the guard rooms themselves being 10.5 feet square. He measured inside the gate from the back wall of one guard room to the back wall of the other, a distance of 43 3/4 feet, the openings to the guard rooms being opposite each other. He made the posts 105 feet, likewise the post of the other gates around the courtyard. The distance along the passage from the outer opening of the gateway to the far side of the entranceway at the inner end of the gateway was 87.5 feet. There were narrow windows to the guard rooms and to their supports facing inward all along the gate. Also, the vestibules had windows all around facing inward. On each side support were carvings of palm trees. Then he brought me into the outer courtyard. There I saw rooms in paved mosaic flooring made for the courtyard all around its perimeter, and 30 rooms facing the flooring. The flooring was alongside the gates and corresponded to the length of the gates, from outside to inside, this lower flooring. He measured it at 175 feet, the distance from inside this lower gate that faced east to the outside of the inner courtyard, and he did the same for the gate that faced north. Next he measured the length and width of the outer courtyard gate that faced north. It had 3 guard rooms on each side, and its support and vestibules were the same size as those as the first gate. Its length was 87.5 feet, and its width 43 3/4 feet. Its windows, vestibule, and palm trees were the same size as those at the east gate. 7 steps led up to it from the outside, while its vestibule was toward the inside. There are gates to the inner courtyard, across from the gates to the north and east. He measured 175 feet from each outer gate to its corresponding inner gate. He led me toward the south, and there I saw a gate that faced south. He measured its supports and vestibule. They were the same size as the others. There were windows in it all around, and its vestibule was like the other windows. The length was 87.5 feet, and the width 43 3/4 feet. 7 steps led up to it from the outside, while its vestibule was toward the inside. It had palm trees, one on each side, on its supports. The inner courtyard and a gate on the south. He measured from gate to gate toward the south 175 feet. He brought me to the inner courtyard through its south gate. He measured the south gate as being the same size. Its guard room, supports, and vestibule were the same size. It had windows and a vestibule surrounding it. It was 87.5 feet long and 43 3/4 feet wide. There was a vestibule around it, 43 3/4 feet long and 8 3/4 feet wide. This vestibule faced the outer courtyard. Palm trees were on its supports, and it had 8 steps leading up to it. He brought me into the inner courtyard, went toward the east, and measured that gate as being the same size. Its guardroom, supports, and vestibule were the same size. It had windows and a vestibule surrounding it. It was 87.5 feet long and 43 3/4 feet wide. Its vestibule faced the outer courtyard. Palm trees were on its supports, both on the one side and on the other, and it had 8 steps leading up to it. He brought me over to the north gate and measured it as being the same size. It had guardroom supports and a vestibule with windows all around. The length was 87.5 feet and the width 43 3/4 feet. Its supports faced the outer courtyard. Palm trees were on its supports, both on one side and on the other, and it had 8 steps leading up to it. There was a room with its entry by the supports at the gates, where the burnt offerings were washed. In the entranceway to the gate were 2 tables on the one side and 2 on the other, on which to slaughter the burnt offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings. On the outside, as one goes up to the entry of the north gate, were 2 tables, and on the other side of the entranceway to the gate were 2 tables. So there were 4 tables on the one side and 4 on the other side by the gate, 8 tables on which to slaughter sacrifices. There were 4 tables of cut stone for the burnt offering, 31.5 inches square and 21 inches high, on which to lay the instruments for slaughtering the burnt offerings and other sacrifices. Hooks, a handbreadth long, were fastened all around the inside of the room. The flesh of the offerings was to be placed on the tables. Outside the inner gate, in the inner courtyard, were rooms for the singers, one facing south alongside the north gate, and one facing north alongside the east gate. He said to me, "This room facing south is for the Kohanim, priests, in charge of the house, while the room facing north is for the Kohanim, in charge of the altar. These are the descendants of Zadok, who are the descendants of Levi, designated to approach Adonai and serve him." Then he measured the courtyard at 175 feet long and 175 feet wide. It was square. The altar was in front of the house. He brought me to the vestibule of the house and measured at 8 3/4 feet the thickness of the walls on either side of its entrance. On each side, these walls extended 5 1/4 feet from the side walls of the vestibule. The length of the vestibule was 35 feet, and the width 19 1/4 feet. Steps led up to it. There were columns on each side of the entrance.